The glass door slammed open so hard it cracked. "Get out of my building!" The CEO screamed, her voice echoing through the entire 40th floor, as two security guards seized Ethan Carter by both arms and dragged him toward the elevator on Christmas Eve in front of his own daughter. What nobody in that room knew was that the folder clutched against Ethan's chest held enough evidence to bury the very company that was throwing him away. If you're watching this from your living room right now, drop your city in the comments below so I can see how far this story has traveled, and hit subscribe, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why this was the worst mistake this CEO ever made. The elevator doors at Sterling and Cross Capital opened on the 40th floor, and Ethan Carter stepped out clutching a manila folder like it was the only thing keeping him upright. His knuckles were white. His shirt, the same one he'd worn 3 days straight because he hadn't had time to go home, stuck to his back with cold sweat. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. But none of that mattered, because for the first time in 6 weeks of digging through spreadsheets until 3 a.m., he finally had proof. Real proof. Bank routing numbers that didn't match. Shell accounts in the Caymans. $12 million that had vanished into nothing over 18 months, disguised as consulting fees to a company that didn't exist. He'd found it. He'd actually found it. And he was about to do the right thing. Down in the lobby, 40 floors below, his 8-year-old daughter Sophie sat on a marble bench beneath a 20-foot Christmas tree, swinging her legs that didn't quite reach the floor, holding a candy cane the security guard at the front desk had given her. She wore her good coat, the red one with the white fur trim that her mother had bought before she passed 2 years back. Sophie had been promised that tonight, finally, after weeks of her dad working late, they were going to drive to her grandmother's house upstate. They were going to bake cookies. They were going to watch the Christmas lights on Maple Street like they did every year. "Daddy's just finishing up," she told the receptionist, swinging her candy cane like a tiny sword. "Then we're gonna have Christmas." The receptionist smiled the kind of smile adults give children when they don't know what else to do. Upstairs, Ethan stood outside a pair of frosted glass doors that read, "Victoria Sterling, Chief Executive Officer." He knocked twice. "Come in." "Come." Victoria Sterling sat behind a desk the size of a small boat in an office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking all of Manhattan, lit up gold and red for the holidays. She was 51 years old, sharp-jawed, dressed in a cream blazer that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly mortgage. She didn't look up from her phone right away. "Ethan," she said, finally setting the phone down. "I have 4 minutes before my car arrives. Make it quick. Ms. Sterling, I need you to look at this." Ethan stepped forward and laid the folder open on her desk, his hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion and adrenaline, both fighting for control of his body. "I found it. The discrepancies in the Hartwell account, the missing transfers from Q2, it's not an accounting error. It's fraud. Someone's been siphoning money out of client accounts for over a year." And Victoria's eyes flicked down to the documents. For 1 second, just one, something in her face flickered. Recognition maybe, fear maybe. But it vanished as fast as it appeared, replaced by something colder. "Who told you to look into the Hartwell account?" "Nobody told me. I noticed the numbers didn't reconcile back in October. I've been pulling records ever since." Ethan pointed at the second page. "Look at this routing number. It traces to a shell company registered in Georgetown. And here," he flipped to the third page, his voice rising with urgency. "Now, this login timestamp doesn't match anyone on the New York team. Someone accessed the Hartwell file remotely at 2 a.m. on a Sunday." "Ethan?" Victoria's voice was flat. "Do you understand what you're accusing me of, running a fraud ring inside my company?" "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm trying to protect the company and the clients. $12 million is gone, Ms. Sterling. Someone needs to—" The door behind him opened. A man walked in, tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the kind of calm, practiced smile that men in expensive suits learn to wear like armor. Richard Voss, Chief Financial Officer, Victoria's right hand for 9 years. Victoria, sorry to interrupt. Richard's eyes swept over Ethan over the folder, and something passed behind them so fast that nobody else in the room caught it. I heard there was a situation. Richard. Victoria gestured at the folder. Ethan thinks we have a fraud problem. Does he? Richard picked up the folder before Ethan could stop him flipping through it with the unbothered ease of a man reading a restaurant menu. Interesting theory. It's not a theory, Ethan said. Those are real transactions, real account numbers. I can walk you through every... Ethan. Richard set the folder down and looked at Victoria, not at him. I think you should know I've been hearing some concerning things about Mr. Carter for weeks now. Accessing files outside his department, pulling client data he has no authorization to view. I was actually planning to bring it to you after the holidays. That's not true. Ethan felt the floor shift under him. I have authorization. I work in compliance. This is literally my job. Is it your job to access the Hartwell account at 2 a.m. on a Sunday? Richard asked quietly. The room went silent. Ethan stared at him. It took a moment, one long, sick, dawning moment for the words to land. The 2 a.m. login. The one he'd flagged as suspicious. Richard had just pointed at the very evidence of his own crime and turned it into an accusation against the man who found it. That wasn't me, Ethan said, his voice lower now, more careful. I never logged in at 2 a.m. I have timestamps showing I was... We can pull the full access logs, Richard said smoothly, if Ms. Sterling wants to take this further, though I'd hate to drag this into the holidays. For everyone's sake. Bah. Victoria looked at Ethan for a long moment. 3 months ago, she would have believed him. 3 months ago, Ethan Carter had been the guy she personally promoted, the guy who'd caught a 6-figure billing error in his first 90 days, the guy whose performance reviews used words like meticulous and trustworthy. But 3 months of whispered comments in hallways of Richard quietly planting seeds, concerns about his judgment, concerns about his stability, since his wife died, concerns about a single father stretched too thin had done their work. Ethan, Victoria said, I need you to hand in your badge. What? Ethan's chest seized. Ms. Sterling, you're not even going to look at the evidence. I looked at it. I see numbers and theories and accusations against people who have worked for this firm for years. What I don't see is proof that you didn't fabricate any of this yourself to cover your own unauthorized access. I didn't fabricate anything. His voice cracked louder than he meant it to. $12 million is missing. Someone is stealing from your clients and you're going to fire the one person who found it. I'm not going to stand here and let you threaten this company on Christmas Eve, Victoria snapped, standing now, her composure cracking into something sharper. Security. Victoria, wait. Ethan stepped toward the desk, not aggressively, just desperately reaching for the folder. Please, just give it to forensic accounting. 24 hours. That's all I'm asking. If I'm wrong, fire me. If I'm right. Get him out, Victoria said. 2 security guards appeared in the doorway. Men Ethan recognized. He'd said good morning to them every day for 3 years, knew one of their kids' names, and now they stepped toward him with their hands already reaching for his arms. Don't touch me, I'll walk, Ethan said, jerking his arm back, his voice shaking now with something between fury and disbelief. Victoria, look at me. I have been here every single night for 6 weeks. I have a daughter sitting in your lobby right now waiting to go see her grandmother for Christmas, and I have been missing dinner with her, missing bedtime, missing everything because I actually thought I was protecting this company. Something flickered across Victoria's face again, but Richard stepped smoothly between them. This is exactly the kind of erratic behavior I was concerned about, Richard murmured to Victoria just loud enough for Ethan to hear. I think it's best we handle this quickly, quietly. Get him out of my building, Victoria said again, turning away, refusing to meet Ethan's eyes. Now. The guards took him by both arms. Ethan didn't fight them, not because he'd given up, but because some small, cold, rational part of him knew that fighting now would only prove their story right. He let them walk him toward the elevator, his folder left behind on Victoria Sterling's desk. evidence of a crime now in the hands of the very man who'd committed it. The elevator doors opened. The guards shoved not gently, and Ethan stumbled in, catching himself on the brass railing. "Merry Christmas," one of the guards muttered, not unkindly, more like an apology, before the doors slid shut. Ethan stood alone in the elevator car as it descended, watching the floor numbers tick down, 39, 38, 37, and felt something in his chest crack open. Not anger yet, not even fear yet, just a hollow, ringing disbelief, the kind that comes right before the real pain arrives. He thought about Sophie, waiting downstairs, in her red coat, with her candy cane. The doors opened on the lobby, and there she was. "Daddy!" Sophie hopped off the marble bench and ran toward him, the candy cane held up like a trophy. "Are we going now? Grandma said she's making the gingerbread house without us if we're late." Ethan dropped to one knee and caught her in both arms, pulling her in tight, burying his face for half a second against her shoulder so she wouldn't see what was happening on his face. "Yeah, baby," he said, his voice rough. "We're going now." "Why do you look like that?" Sophie pulled back, studying him with the unbearable clarity that only children have. "Did something bad happen?" "No." He forced a smile, smoothing down her hair. "Nothing bad happened. Daddy's just tired."
Menu.
He stood, took her small hand in his, and walked her toward the revolving doors of Sterling and Cross Capital, past the security desk, where the same guard who'd given Sophie her candy cane wouldn't meet his eyes, past the 20-foot Christmas tree, glittering with gold lights, out into the freezing New York night, where snow had just begun to fall. Behind him, 40 floors up, Richard Voss closed Victoria Sterling's office door, picked up Ethan's folder from her desk, and walked it directly to the shredder in the records room. Outside, Ethan buckled Sophie into her booster seat in the back of his 10-year-old Honda, the heater struggling against the cold, the dashboard light illuminating his face as he sat behind the wheel for a long moment without starting the engine. "Daddy!" Sophie's small voice came from the back seat. "Are we still gonna have Christmas?" Ethan closed his eyes. Somewhere inside that building, a folder containing 6 weeks of his life. 6 weeks of late nights, of missed dinners, of doing the one thing he thought mattered, which was doing the right thing. Even when nobody was watching, was probably already in a shredder. He had no job, no severance, no proof. Just an accusation hanging over his name that would follow him to every interview he ever walked into for the rest of his career, terminated for unauthorized access, suspicious behavior.
No.
And 40 miles away, a frozen half-stocked apartment with 3 days left on the heating bill before the gas company shut it off. He looked in the rearview mirror at his daughter's face, small, hopeful, still wearing her grandmother's promised gingerbread house, like a certainty in her eyes. And he made a decision in that frozen parking garage that would define the next 6 months of his life. "Yeah, baby," he said, starting the engine. "We're still gonna have Christmas." He didn't know yet what was waiting on the other side of that promise. He didn't know that somewhere in this story, months from now, Victoria Sterling would be standing in front of federal investigators, watching the man she trusted most get let out in handcuffs. He didn't know that his daughter, this same 8-year-old girl clutching a candy cane in the back seat, would one day stand in front of that very CEO and ask a single question that would break her wide open. All Ethan knew, driving out of that parking garage with $23 in his checking account and a daughter who still believed in gingerbread houses, was that he had done the right thing, and the right thing had cost him everything. He drove north out of the city, snow collecting on the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. His daughter humming jingle bells softly in the back seat, unaware that her father's hands were trembling on the steering wheel. Not from the cold, but from the terrifying, bottomless question of how he was going to feed her house, her, and protect her, now that the one place that was supposed to reward honesty had just thrown it away like garbage. Bah! In the rearview mirror, the lights of Manhattan shrank behind them, gold and red and glittering, a city full of parties and warm apartments, and people who had no idea that $12 million was quietly bleeding out of an investment firm 40 floors above the street, and that the one man who'd tried to stop it was now driving away into the dark with nothing but his daughter, his integrity, and a memory so detailed it would become the only weapon he had left. He didn't cry. Not yet. Sophie was watching, even if she pretended not to be glancing at him every few minutes in the way kids do when they sense something's wrong but don't have the words for it. "Daddy," she said quietly, somewhere around exit 14. "Is it because of work? The thing that's making you sad?" Ethan glanced at her in the mirror. He thought about lying. He thought about all the small protective lies parents tell their children. Everything's fine. Don't worry. It's nothing. And for one moment, he almost reached for one. Instead, he said, "Daddy tried to do something good today, and it didn't work out the way I wanted." Sophie considered this with the seriousness only an 8-year-old can manage. "Did you still try, though?" "Yeah," Ethan said, his throat tight. "I still tried." "Then it still counts," she said simply, and went back to looking out the window at the snow as if she had just settled something important, and turned back to her own private thoughts of gingerbread houses and Christmas morning. Ethan didn't answer. He just drove the wipers ticking back and forth, the heater finally beginning to warm the car. His daughter's small voice humming Christmas songs in the back seat, while somewhere behind him in a glass office, 40 floors above the city, the man who had actually stolen $12 million was sleeping soundly, certain that the only person who could have stopped him had just been thrown out into the snow. The apartment was cold when they got home that night, the kind of cold that seeps into the walls of a building where the landlord turns the heat down after 9 to save money. Ethan carried Sophie up the 3 flights of stairs because the elevator had been broken since October. Her head heavy on his shoulder, half asleep, still murmuring something about gingerbread houses. He laid her down on the pull-out couch in the living room. Her bedroom was being used as storage for boxes he hadn't unpacked since the move, and pulled the blanket up to her chin. He sat on the edge of the couch for a long time after she fell asleep, staring at the wall, his phone in his hand. $23.14. He checked the number 3 times like it might change. It didn't. His phone buzzed. A text from his sister Claire, 3 states away. "Hey, you guys still coming up tomorrow? Mom's already started the gingerbread." He stared at the message for a long time before he typed back. "Change of plans. Got held up at work. We'll call you on Christmas morning instead." He couldn't tell her. Not tonight. Not over text, not at 11 o'clock on Christmas Eve, not when she had 3 kids of her own to get to bed and a husband who worked nights. He'd tell her eventually, just not now. He didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen that was almost out of ink, and he started writing down everything he remembered. Every transaction, every routing number, every date and timestamp he'd memorized over 6 weeks of staring at spreadsheets until his eyes burned. He wrote until 4 a.m. filling page after page, because even though they'd taken his folder, even though Richard Voss had probably already fed it through a shredder, they couldn't take what was in his head. By the time the sun came up gray and thin over the building across the street, he had 11 pages of notes. It wasn't proof. Not legally. But it was a start. Sophie woke up at 7, the way kids do on Christmas morning, no matter what else is happening in their parents' lives, and she came padding into the kitchen, in her socks rubbing her eyes. "Is Santa coming here instead of Grandma's?" she asked. "Is Santa coming?" Shetty. Ethan looked at the legal pad, quickly flipped it shut, and stood up. "Santa already came," he said. "Look under the tree." There wasn't a tree. There hadn't been time. But there was a small box he'd wrapped at 2 in the morning, a stuffed rabbit he'd bought weeks ago, before any of this happened, back when he still thought he was just a guy working late on an audit. He set it on the coffee table. Sophie's face lit up like he'd handed her the whole world. She didn't ask where the tree was. She didn't ask why they weren't at Grandma's. She just tore into the paper and hugged the rabbit to her chest and said, "I'm gonna name her Snowball." And for one moment watching her, Ethan forgot everything that had happened the day before. Then his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer it. Some instinct told him to. "Mr. Carter." A woman's voice, brisk, professional. "This is Karen Whitfield. I'm an attorney specializing in employment and securities law. I got your name from a mutual contact, Dana Reyes, in HR. She reached out to me last night. She said you might need help." Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. Dana Reyes. He barely knew her. They'd crossed paths a few times in the break room, exchanged maybe a dozen sentences total over 3 years. He had no idea she even knew what had happened. How did she? She heard what happened in Victoria Sterling's office yesterday. Word travels fast in a building like that, Mr. Carter, especially on a holiday, when half the staff are gossiping in the elevator on their way out. Dana says you found something. Financial irregularities. She said you tried to report it and got walked out instead. Ethan sat down slowly at the kitchen table, watching Sophie across the room playing with her new rabbit, oblivious. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's what happened." "I want to be straight with you," Karen said. "I don't do pro bono work as a rule, but whistleblower cases involving securities fraud, if what you found is real, and if you can substantiate it, there are protections. Federal protections. And depending on the size of the fraud, there could be a financial recovery for you too, under the SEC's whistleblower program. Are you willing to meet with me?" "I don't have any money to pay a retainer," Ethan said honestly. "I've got $23 in my checking account and a daughter who needs new shoes." There was a pause on the line. "I work on contingency for cases like this," Karen said. "If there's nothing to recover, you owe me nothing. If there is, we talk percentages then. But Mr. Carter, I need you to understand something important right now before we go any further. If what you're describing is true, you are about to become a target. Not just professionally. The people who did this, if they're willing to fabricate a story to get you fired the same day you found the fraud, they are not going to stop there. You need to be careful. You need to document everything, and you need to do it through proper legal channels, not on your own." Ethan looked over at Sophie, who had abandoned the rabbit for a moment and was now standing at the window watching snow fall onto the fire escape. "When can we meet?" he asked. "Tomorrow. Bring whatever you have. Even if it's just memory and notes, that's a start. We'll build from there." She hung up. Ethan sat there for a long moment, staring at the legal pad on the table. 11 pages of numbers and dates that suddenly felt less like the wreckage of his career and more like the first brick of something else entirely. That night, after Sophie was asleep again, he opened his laptop and began transcribing his notes into a clean, organized document, dates, account numbers, login timestamps, everything cross-referenced the way he used to do in his old job before the world fell apart. He worked until his eyes blurred, fueled by the kind of grim, focused anger that doesn't show on your face but burns steady underneath everything you do. 3 weeks passed. They were hard weeks. The kind of hard that doesn't announce itself with one big crisis, but instead arrives in 100 small ones stacked on top of each other until the weight becomes unbearable. The heat got shut off twice before Ethan figured out which neighbor to bribe with cash to keep the building's ancient boiler limping along. He applied to 19 jobs in financial compliance and got 4 rejections and 15 silences. He started to suspect, and later confirmed through a contact at a recruiting firm, that someone at Sterling and Cross had quietly flagged his file. Not officially. Nothing on paper. Just a whisper passed from one HR department to another, unauthorized access, terminated, do not rehire. A blacklist with no name attached to it, but a blacklist all the same. "They're not just trying to discredit me," he told Karen Whitfield during their 3rd meeting, sitting in her modest downtown office that smelled like old coffee and printer toner. "They're trying to make sure I disappear." "That's exactly what they're doing," Karen said, sliding a folder across the desk. His own notes now formatted into something resembling a formal complaint. "And it tells me something important, Ethan. People don't go to this much trouble to bury someone who's wrong. They go to this much trouble to bury someone who's right." Ethan filed the whistleblower complaint with the SEC on the 2nd week of January, his hands shaking as he signed the final page, not from fear this time, but from something closer to relief. The feeling of finally putting something heavy down after carrying it alone for too long. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we wait," Karen said. "The SEC will open a preliminary inquiry. It could take weeks, it could take months. In the meantime, I need you to keep your head down. No public statements, no confrontations, no social media posts about Sterling and Cross, no matter how badly you want to. If they're already trying to discredit you, the worst thing you can do is hand them ammunition." It was the hardest advice Ethan had ever followed. Every fiber of him wanted to scream the truth from a rooftop, wanted to walk back into that building and stand in the lobby and tell every employee walking past what Victoria Sterling and Richard Voss had really done. But he thought about Sophie. He thought about the 11 pages of notes that had become a federal case. He thought about what Karen had said, "They will not stop there." And he swallowed every furious word and went back to applying for jobs nobody would give him. To keep food on the table, he took whatever he could find. He drove for a rideshare app 3 nights a week after Sophie went to bed, leaving her with Mrs. Alvarez down the hall, an older widow who'd taken a liking to Sophie and didn't charge much. He picked up shifts stocking shelves at a hardware store on weekends. He sold his watch, a gift from his late wife, the one thing of value he had left besides his car, to a pawn shop 2 blocks from the apartment, and he didn't tell anyone. Not even Karen, because some humiliations are too private even for the people trying to help you. One Tuesday evening in late January, he stood in line at a food bank 3 blocks from Sophie's school, his collar pulled up against the wind, a box of canned goods balanced against his hip, and he saw a face he recognized from 2 cubicles over at his old job. The man Marcus from the risk management team saw him too. For a second, neither of them said anything. "Ethan," Marcus said finally, awkward, shifting his own box of groceries. "Hey man, I heard what happened." "Did you?" Ethan said, his voice flat, guarded. "I didn't believe it," Marcus said quietly, glancing around as if someone might be listening. "The story they put out, unauthorized access, falsifying records, none of us believed it. You're the most by-the-book guy in that whole department. But nobody's saying anything because everybody's scared. Voss let 2 more people go last week. Both of them had asked questions about the Hartwell account." Ethan's chest tightened. 2 more people. Sandra from accounting and that new kid Felix from IT. Both gone within 48 hours of pulling old access logs. Marcus lowered his voice further. "Whatever you found, man, it's still there. They're just better at hiding it now." It was the first piece of real useful information Ethan had gotten in 3 weeks, and it landed like a jolt of electricity straight through his exhaustion. "Marcus," he said carefully, "if you ever wanted to talk, really talk, there's a lawyer I'm working with. Nothing has to happen unless you want it to, but if you saw anything—" "I didn't see anything," Marcus said quickly, too quickly, his eyes darting toward the food bank entrance. "I gotta go, man. Good luck, I mean that." He turned and walked away fast, leaving Ethan standing in the cold, with his box of canned soup and powdered milk watching him go. He told Karen about the conversation the next morning over the phone. "That's significant," she said. 2 more terminations tied to the same account in the same window. That's not coincidence, that's pattern. I'm going to push the SEC contact for an update. This might move faster than we thought." But faster in federal terms still meant weeks. And weeks for a single father with $23 and a daughter to feed felt like an eternity. Damn. Back inside Sterling and Cross Capital, life continued as though nothing had happened. Victoria Sterling hosted a New Year's gala on the 40th floor, all crystal champagne flutes and string quartets, congratulating herself in a speech about the firm's resilience and integrity in the year ahead. Richard Voss stood near the bar the entire night, smiling, shaking hands, occasionally glancing at his phone with an expression nobody else noticed. What nobody at that party knew, what even Victoria didn't know, was that Richard had spent the past 3 weeks quietly liquidating the shell accounts faster than ever, moving money through 3 more layers of offshore structuring, terrified that Ethan's complaint, wherever it had gone, might eventually surface. He'd had Sandra and Felix terminated, not because they'd found anything concrete, but because they'd simply asked the wrong question at the wrong time. And Richard Voss had learned, over 9 years of careful theft, that paranoia kept you alive.
Chapter 新闻
He didn't know about the SEC filing, not yet. But he felt something shifting beneath the surface of his comfortable life, the way an animal senses a storm before the sky changes color. And it made him reckless in small, dangerous ways. Extra withdrawals, sloppier timestamps, a growing carelessness born from growing fear. Victoria, for her part, noticed none of it. She trusted Richard completely. He had been her mentor when she first joined the firm 15 years ago, the man who'd taught her everything about the business, the man she'd promoted to CFO with total confidence. The idea that he could be behind a multi-million-dollar fraud never once crossed her mind. If anything, the events of Christmas Eve had only reinforced her trust in him. He'd been the one to step in calm and composed, while an erratic, unstable employee made wild accusations in her office. In her mind, Richard had protected her. Ethan had threatened her. She thought about Ethan sometimes in quiet moments late at night in the back of her town car, staring out at the city lights. She told herself it was nothing. A difficult decision made under pressure, the kind every executive has to make. But there was a small, persistent splinter lodged somewhere beneath her certainty, and it surfaced at the strangest times when she signed off on a year-end bonus for Richard, when she walked past the spot in the lobby, where she remembered faintly a little girl in a red coat holding a candy cane. She pushed the thought away each time. She had a company to run. February arrived cold and unforgiving. Ethan's car, the only thing standing between him and total isolation, the only way he could pick up rideshare fares and get Sophie to school, broke down on a Thursday morning with a sound like a dying animal, and the mechanic quoted him $800 he didn't have. He sat in the mechanic's waiting room with his head in his hands doing math that didn't work, no matter how he rearranged it, when his phone rang. Karen. Ethan, I need you to sit down. I'm sitting, he said. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. The SEC opened a formal investigation this morning. They reviewed your filing, cross-referenced it with 2 anonymous tips that came in separately. Looks like your old co-worker Marcus wasn't the only one who decided to talk after all, and they're moving forward with subpoenas for Sterling and Cross's financial records. Ethan sat very still, the phone pressed hard against his ear, the noise of the mechanic's shop fading into a dull ring. They believe me. They believe there's enough here to investigate. That's the first real step, Ethan. It's not over. It could still take months. But this is real now. This is no longer just you against them. He hung up the phone and sat in that waiting room for a long time, staring at a calendar on the wall advertising motor oil. Feeling something unfamiliar move through his chest. Not relief, not yet, but something close to it. The first crack of light through a door he'd thought was permanently shut. He picked Sophie up from school that afternoon on foot, holding her hand as they walked the 11 blocks home in the cold, because the car was still in the shop, and she chattered the whole way about a school project on the solar system, about a boy named Tyler who'd eaten paste about 100 small, beautiful, ordinary things that had nothing to do with fraud or federal investigations or $23 in a checking account. Daddy, she said, suddenly stopping on the sidewalk, looking up at him with that same unbearable clarity from Christmas Eve. Are we going to be okay? Ethan crouched down to her level, right there on the sidewalk, ignoring the cold seeping through his jeans. Yeah, baby, he said, and for the first time since Christmas Eve, he actually believed it when he said it. We're going to be okay. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with Karen's number saved at the top of his contacts and a fresh legal pad in front of him, and he started writing down everything Marcus had told him at the food bank. Sandra Felix, the Hartwell account, the pattern of terminations. Because if the SEC was building a case, he wanted to make sure they had every piece he could give them. He didn't know, sitting there in that cold kitchen with a cup of instant coffee going lukewarm beside him, that 40 floors up in a glass office overlooking the city, Richard Voss had just received a phone call from a contact inside the SEC's regional office, a contact he'd cultivated over years through donations and favors, warning him quietly that an investigation had been opened into Sterling and Cross's financial records. Richard sat alone in his office after the call ended, the city lights spread out below him like a field of dying stars. And for the first time in 9 years of careful, patient theft, he felt something close to panic.
Bushade.
He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in over a year. A man in the Caymans who specialized in making problems disappear in more ways than one. And as he waited for the call to connect, he glanced at a framed photo on his desk. Himself and Victoria Sterling, 10 years younger. Shaking hands the day she made him CFO. Both of them smiling like the world belonged to them. "It's me," Richard said when the call connected. His voice low-controlled, but with a tremor underneath that hadn't been there in years. "We have a problem. I need everything moved. Tonight."
Jen.
3 blocks away, in a building with a broken elevator and a heater that worked only when bribed. Ethan Carter fell asleep at his kitchen table with a legal pad full of names under his hand, unaware that the very call he'd been waiting weeks to make happen, the call that would finally turn the tide, had already set something dangerous and desperate into motion 40 floors above the city he could no longer afford to live comfortably in. The car that broke down on the deserted highway that February night didn't belong to Ethan. It belonged to Victoria Sterling. It happened on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after Richard Voss made that frantic call to the Caymans, 3 weeks during which Ethan had spent every spare hour helping Karen Whitfield assemble a case file that grew thicker by the day. Victoria had been driving back from a donor dinner upstate, her usual driver out sick behind the wheel of her own Mercedes for the first time in months. When the engine sputtered, coughed and died on a stretch of Route 9 with no streetlights, no gas stations, nothing but black trees and a thin dusting of snow glowing faintly under a sliver of moon. She sat there for 10 minutes trying to restart it, growing more frustrated with every failed turn of the key before she finally gave up and called roadside assistance. They told her 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours given the weather. She was alone in a $5,000 coat on a highway with no cell signal strong enough to call anyone who could come faster, and for the first time in a very long time, Victoria Sterling felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel: helpless. Headlights appeared in her rear-view mirror 20 minutes later. An old Honda, the kind with a slight rattle in the engine, pulled onto the shoulder behind her. Victoria's hand moved instinctively to the door lock. A man stepped out of the car, his breath fogging in the cold, a flashlight in one hand. "You all right in there?" he called out, walking toward her window, not too fast, keeping his distance the way someone does when they don't want to scare a stranded driver. Victoria cracked her window an inch. "I've called roadside assistance. They're on their way." On a night like this on this stretch of road could be a while. The man crouched slightly so she could see his face in the glow of his flashlight. "I used to do roadside repair on weekends years back before business school ate my whole life." "Mind if I take a look?" "Won't charge you anything. Just hate seeing somebody stuck out here in this cold." Something about his voice tugged at her familiar in a way she couldn't immediately place, but the dark and the cold, and her own exhaustion blurred the recognition. She hesitated, then nodded and popped the hood. He worked for almost 20 minutes, his hands red and raw from the cold, occasionally muttering to himself, occasionally asking her to try the ignition while he checked something else. Victoria sat behind the wheel, watching him through the windshield. This stranger kneeling in the snow on the side of a dark highway, fixing her car for nothing, expecting nothing on a night so cold that even talking made your breath visible. "Try it now," he called. She turned the key. The engine roared to life. Relief flooded through her, fast and overwhelming, and she stepped out of the car, despite the cold, wanting to thank him properly. He was closing the hood, wiping his hands on a rag he must have kept in his own trunk, and when he turned to face her fully under the dome light of her open car door, something in Victoria's chest went still. She knew that face. "Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her for a long moment. Recognition passed between them, heavy and silent, the cold air thick with everything neither of them said. The man who had spent the last 2 months scraping together rideshare fares and food bank groceries because she'd had him thrown out of her building on Christmas Eve was standing in front of her now, having just fixed her car for free in the freezing dark, expecting nothing. "You should get that battery checked," he said, finally, his voice even, almost gentle. "It's old. Might not hold a charge much longer." "Ethan, Victoria's voice caught. She didn't know what she wanted to say. An apology felt insufficient, and somehow also too large, too complicated to fit into a moment on the side of a dark highway. "Why would you stop after everything that—" "Because you needed help," Ethan said simply. He didn't say it bitterly. He didn't say it like a man scoring a point. He said it the way you'd state a fact about the weather, plain and unadorned, and somehow that made it land harder than any accusation could have. He walked back to his car without waiting for a response, climbed in and pulled away into the dark, his taillights shrinking down the empty highway until they disappeared completely, leaving Victoria standing alone beside her running car in the cold, staring after him. She didn't move for a long time. She thought about the folder he'd laid on her desk on Christmas Eve. She thought about the look on his face when security took his arms. She thought about the 8-year-old girl in the red coat she'd glimpsed once in the lobby, swinging her legs on a marble bench. And a slow, sick feeling began spreading through Victoria's chest, the kind of feeling that doesn't announce itself loudly, but instead settles in quietly and refuses to leave. She drove the rest of the way home in silence, her radio off, her hands tight on the wheel, replaying that one sentence over and over. Because you needed help. She didn't sleep well that night.
By now, Marie.
2 weeks later, Sterling and Cross Capital hosted its annual winter charity gala, a glittering affair held in a downtown ballroom with a string quartet, a silent auction, and 300 of the firm's wealthiest clients in attendance, all raising money. Ironically, Victoria would later think for a foundation supporting financial literacy in underserved communities. She stood near the entrance in a dark green gown, shaking hands, smiling the smile she'd perfected over 15 years of climbing to the top of a brutal industry, while a small, persistent unease churned beneath her composure, an unease that had been growing steadily since that night on Route 9. She didn't know that Karen Whitfield had encouraged Ethan to attend, not to confront anyone, not to make a scene, but because the foundation the gala supported had years earlier helped Ethan's late wife when she was a struggling single mother herself, before she and Ethan had even met, and Ethan had quietly purchased the cheapest available ticket weeks in advance, before any of this had happened, back when he still worked at the firm and the gala was just a nice evening out. He almost didn't go. He'd debated it for days, sitting at his kitchen table with the ticket in front of him, Karen's voice in his head reminding him to keep a low profile, to let the investigation run its course, without doing anything that could be twisted into evidence of erratic behavior. But Sophie had a school project on philanthropy due that week, and some part of him, some stubborn, quiet part, that refused to let Victoria Sterling and Richard Voss define what kind of man he was, decided to bring her along, dressed in her best dress, to show her what it looked like to support something good, even when the world had been unkind to you. He didn't expect to see Victoria at the door. He didn't expect Sophie to recognize her either, until Sophie tugged on his sleeve and whispered, "Daddy, isn't that the lady from your old job? The one in the pictures on your phone?" Ethan's whole body went rigid. He hadn't realized Sophie had ever seen a picture of Victoria Sterling, some old work event photo, probably glimpsed once on his phone months ago, and filed away in that strange, perfect memory children have for faces that matter to the people they love. Sophie don't. But Sophie was already walking toward her, small and fearless in her best dress, weaving between adults in evening gowns and tuxedos with the singular focus only a child can manage. And Ethan moved fast to catch up, his heart-hammering panic rising in his throat. "Sophie! Wait!" Too late. Sophie stopped directly in front of Victoria. Sterling looked up at her with wide, serious eyes and asked in a voice clear enough to cut through the noise of the string quartet and the clinking glasses around them. "If my daddy was a good man, why did you fire him?" The ballroom didn't go silent. There were 300 people, multiple conversations, a band still playing, but everyone within 10 feet did. Victoria froze her champagne glass halfway to her lips, staring down at this small girl in a navy blue dress, her hair in two neat braids, looking up at her, without anger, without performance, just genuine devastating confusion. Sophie! Ethan reached her, crouching down his hand on her shoulder, mortified and breaking apart inside all at once. Sweetheart, you can't just... It's a fair question, Victoria said quietly, surprising both of them. She crouched down too, her green gown pooling on the ballroom floor, bringing herself level with Sophie, despite the eyes now turning toward them from every direction. What's your name? Sophie. Sophie. Victoria's voice was unsteady, in a way Ethan had never heard from her before, not once in 3 years of working under her. I made a mistake. A big one. I'm still trying to figure out how to fix it. Sophie considered this with the same seriousness she'd given everything since Christmas Eve. Then she reached into the small beaded purse her grandmother had given her for the occasion and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the creases from being carried around for days. Daddy wrote this a long time ago, she said, holding it out. He keeps it in his desk drawer. I took it because I thought maybe if you read it, you'd remember he's not a bad person. Ethan's stomach dropped. He hadn't known Sophie had taken anything from his desk. It was the original list, the very first version of his notes handwritten the night he was fired before Karen had helped him formalize everything into legal language. Account numbers, dates, the Hartwell discrepancies. 11 items in his own shaky, exhausted handwriting from that first sleepless night. Victoria took the paper with hands that weren't entirely steady. She unfolded it slowly, and even in the dim golden light of the ballroom, even with a string quartet playing somewhere behind her, and 300 guests pretending not to watch, she could read every line clearly enough to feel the floor shift beneath her heels. Sophie, Ethan said gently, taking his daughter's hand, his voice tight with a dozen emotions at once. We should go find our table. Wait. Victoria stood, the paper still in her hand, her composure cracking visibly now, something raw showing through 15 years of careful executive polish. Ethan, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Is this real? All of it? Every word, Ethan said. It was real in December. It's still real now. I filed a complaint with the SEC in January. They opened a formal investigation 3 weeks ago. Victoria's face went pale. The SEC. I tried to tell you in your office. I tried for 6 weeks before that, through every proper channel I had. Memos to compliance. A meeting request to Richard that he canceled twice. I did everything right, Victoria, and you fired me anyway on Christmas Eve in front of my daughter because Richard Voss told you a story that was easier to believe than the truth. The band kept playing. The guests around them slowly turned back to their own conversations, sensing something private and significant happening that wasn't theirs to witness. Victoria stood there holding a folded piece of paper covered in a child's father's handwriting, feeling something inside her, some final stubborn wall of certainty, begin to crumble. I want to see everything, she said quietly. Everything you have, tonight if possible, tomorrow at the latest. Talk to my lawyer, Ethan said. Karen Whitfield. She has all of it. I'm not handing anything directly to you, Victoria. Not after Christmas Eve. It was the first time he'd called her by her first name since that day. And something about the directness of it, no Ms. Sterling, no deference, seemed to land harder than anything else he'd said. That's fair, Victoria said. That's more than fair. She handed the folded paper back to Sophie, who took it carefully and tucked it back into her small beaded purse, looking between the two adults with the quiet confusion of a child who has just done something important without fully understanding why. Thank you for fixing my car, Victoria said, looking at Ethan, now her voice barely above the noise of the room. I should have said it properly that night. I didn't know how. Ethan didn't respond right away. He took Sophie's hand and turned to walk away, and it was only after a few steps that he paused and looked back over his shoulder. You're welcome, he said. Just that. Nothing more. And then he led his daughter toward their table at the far end of the ballroom, leaving Victoria Sterling standing alone near the entrance with a glass of champagne going warm in her hand, and a feeling in her chest she hadn't experienced in years. The unmistakable, unbearable sensation of having been wrong, completely and catastrophically wrong about something that mattered. She left the gala early that night, citing a headache to her assistant, and went straight to her office instead of home. She sat behind her desk, the same desk where Ethan had laid his evidence 2 months earlier, and she opened her laptop and began pulling every record she had access to related to the Hartwell account, working alone past midnight, something she hadn't done in years. Not since she'd clawed her way up from analyst to executive on nothing but raw determination and an instinct for catching what others missed. Oh, what she found that night didn't immediately implicate Richard. The fraud had been built, carefully layered over years, designed by someone who understood exactly how the firm's internal controls worked, because he'd helped design half of them himself. But she found enough discrepancies even Ethan hadn't flagged transfers that didn't match invoices. A pattern of access logs clustering suspiciously around dates when Richard was traveling on client business, to know with mounting certainty that this was not a misunderstanding. She called Karen Whitfield's office first thing the next morning and requested a formal meeting, bringing her own legal counsel, agreeing against the advice of her general counsel, who urged caution, urged delay, urged managing the situation internally, to authorize an independent forensic audit of the firm's accounts conducted by an outside team with no ties to anyone currently employed at Sterling & Cross. It took the forensic team 11 days to find what Ethan had spent 6 sleepless weeks trying to prove. The 11th day fell on a Friday in early March, gray and raining, the kind of day that makes Manhattan feel smaller and grimmer than usual. The forensic team's lead investigator, a meticulous woman named Patricia Nguyen, who had spent 20 years untangling corporate fraud cases for the SEC before going independent, requested an emergency meeting with Victoria, her general counsel, and at Victoria's insistence, over her counsel's strong objection, Karen Whitfield and Ethan Carter. They gathered in a conference room on the 38th floor, 2 floors below Victoria's office, a room Ethan hadn't set foot in since the day he was fired. His hands were steady this time. He'd waited 2 months for this moment, and whatever fear he might have once carried into a room like this had long since burned away, replaced by something calmer, harder, more certain. Patricia Nguyen laid out the findings methodically, page by page, projected onto a screen at the front of the room. Deleted emails recovered from backup servers. Conversations between Richard Voss and an account specialist in the Caymans, discussing structuring and movement timing in language that, stripped of its careful corporate euphemism, amounted to a roadmap for laundering stolen funds. Forged audit reports, signed with a digital signature that traced back to a login credential issued to Richard's executive assistant, who, when contacted, swore under oath she had never accessed those files and had been on vacation the week the reports were generated. Manipulated access records showing Richard had personally logged into the Hartwell account 17 times over 18 months, always late at night, always when the rest of the compliance team had gone home. And the total, when Patricia finally reached the last slide, made the entire room go silent. $14.3 million, she said. Routed through 6 shell entities across 3 jurisdictions, disguised as consulting fees, vendor payments, and 1 questionable real estate transaction in the Caymans. Based on the documentation we've recovered, this has been ongoing for approximately 26 months. Victoria sat very still at the head of the table, her face pale, her hands folded tightly in front of her. And Mr. Carter's original complaint, Patricia continued, glancing toward Ethan, which I understand was dismissed, and the employee subsequently terminated his findings, were not only accurate, they identified the exact account and the exact pattern that ultimately broke this case open. If his original report had been investigated in December when he first raised it, this fraud could have been stopped before another $4 million disappeared in January and February. The number hit the room like a physical weight. $4 million. stolen in the 2 months after Ethan was fired. 2 months he'd spent standing in food bank lines and selling his wife's watch and driving strangers around the city at midnight to keep the heat on, while the man who'd actually committed the crime continued stealing uninterrupted because the one person who'd tried to stop him had been thrown out into the snow. "Where is Richard now?" Victoria asked, her voice tight-controlled, but with something dangerous underneath it. "That's the other thing," Patricia said carefully. Mr. Voss requested an extended leave of absence last week, citing a family emergency. He flew to the Caymans on Tuesday. We've confirmed through banking records that significant transfers were initiated from the shell accounts within 48 hours of his departure. "He's running," Karen Whitfield said flatly. "We believe so, which is why I'd recommend moving immediately. I've already been in contact with the SEC's Enforcement Division, given the active investigation already underway from Mr. Carter's original complaint. They're prepared to coordinate with federal authorities, but we need authorization from you, Ms. Sterling, to freeze the firm's remaining outbound transfers and formally report the additional findings before he moves the rest of the money beyond reach." Victoria didn't hesitate. "Do it. Freeze everything. Authorize whatever you need." She turned to look at Ethan, then across the long conference table, the screen behind her still displaying the number 14.3 million in stark white text. And something passed over her face that looked almost like grief. "You tried to tell me," she said quietly. "Multiple times. Through every channel available to you. And I let a man I trusted for 15 years convince me that you were the problem." "Yeah," Ethan said. There was no satisfaction in his voice, no triumph, just exhaustion and something underneath it that was almost sad. "You did." "I don't know how to fix 2 months of your life," Victoria said. "I don't know how to fix what you went through, what your daughter went through." "You can't," Ethan said simply. "Some things don't get fixed. They just get acknowledged, or they don't." The room sat in heavy silence for a moment, the rain ticking softly against the windows 38 floors above the street, before Karen Whitfield finally spoke, her voice cutting through the weight of it with practical urgency. "Ms. Sterling, time is critical here. If Mr. Voss is moving funds out of the Caymans, every hour matters. I'd suggest we get the SEC and FBI on a call within the hour." Victoria nodded, pulling herself back into the role she knew best, decisive, controlled, and command, even as something inside her remained fractured from everything she'd just learned. "Make the calls," she said. "All of them. And someone get me Richard Voss's flight information. I want to know exactly where he is." Patricia Nguyen was already dialing before Victoria finished the sentence. Karen pulled out her own phone, stepping toward the window to get a clearer signal, already speaking in low, urgent tones to someone on the other end. The room shifted into motion, phones, ringing voices overlapping, the machinery of federal law enforcement beginning to turn. Ethan sat quietly at the table through all of it, watching the chaos unfold around him, feeling something he hadn't expected to feel after 2 months of fighting just to survive. Not vindication, not yet, but the first real sense that the truth, once buried so carefully and for so long, was finally too large to stay hidden any longer. Outside, 38 floors below, the rain kept falling on a city that had no idea yet that within 72 hours, federal agents would be standing in the lobby of Sterling and Cross Capital with warrants in hand, and that the executive who had stolen $14 million from his own company's clients was at that very moment standing in a private banking office on Grand Cayman, sweating through his shirt, watching a transfer screen freeze mid-transaction with a red error message that read simply, "Account access restricted." Richard Voss stared at the red error message on the banking terminal for a full 10 seconds before his brain caught up with what his eyes were telling him. Account access restricted. He tried the transfer again. Same message. He tried logging into a second account, one he'd kept in reserve for exactly this kind of emergency. Untouched for 3 years, clean as far as he knew. Same message. "Is there a problem with the system?" he asked the banking officer across the desk, keeping his voice level, professional, the same tone he'd used in 1,000 client meetings, Over 9 years of careful theft. The banking officer. A young man named Desmond, who had handled Richard's accounts personally for the past 2 years and had never once asked a question he wasn't supposed to ask, looked uncomfortable for the first time since Richard had known him. "I'm not entirely sure, sir. I'm seeing a compliance flag at the institutional level. I'd need to escalate this to our legal department." Richard felt his stomach drop straight through the floor. He stood up too fast, his chair scraping loudly against the marble, and forced himself to slow down to breathe, to look like a man mildly inconvenienced, rather than a man whose entire carefully constructed life had just begun collapsing in real time. "That won't be necessary," he said. "I'll handle it through my office in New York. Thank you, Desmond." He walked out of the bank into the bright, oppressive heat of Georgetown, his shirt already damp with sweat that had nothing to do with the Caribbean sun, and he pulled out his phone with hands that were no longer quite steady. He called his contact at the SEC's regional office first. No answer. He called again. No answer. He sent a text, 3 words. "Call me now," and watched the message sit there delivered, but unread for 5 long minutes, while he stood on a sidewalk in a foreign country, with his entire fortune suddenly frozen behind a wall of compliance flags he didn't have the power to remove. His phone rang. He answered before the first ring finished. Richard. It wasn't his SEC contact. It was Victoria. He almost dropped the phone. He recovered fast, the old instincts kicking in, smoothing his voice into something calm and slightly concerned. "Victoria, hi. I was actually about to call you. Everything all right back home?" "Don't," Victoria said. Just that one word, flat and cold, and something in the way she said it told Richard everything he needed to know. "Don't do that. Don't pretend with me right now, Richard. We found everything. The shell accounts, the forged signatures, the login records. $14.3 million, Richard. 26 months. Richard stood very still on the sidewalk, the heat pressing down on him, a tour group of cruise ship passengers laughing somewhere behind him, oblivious to the fact that the careful architecture of his entire life had just come crashing down in a single phone call. "Victoria, I can explain. You can explain it to the FBI," she said. "They're already coordinating with the SEC. There's a federal warrant being processed right now. I'd suggest you get yourself a very good lawyer, Richard, because in about 12 hours, agents are going to be waiting for you at the airport when you try to come home. And if you don't come home, that's going to look a great deal worse for you. You don't understand," Richard said, his composure finally cracking, his voice rising with a desperation Victoria had never once heard from him in 15 years of working together. "There were things, pressures, debts I had to—" "I don't care," Victoria said, and her voice was shaking now too, but with something different than his, not panic, but grief, and underneath the grief, a hardening fury that had been building since the moment she'd read Patricia Nguyen's report. "I trusted you with everything, Richard. I trusted you when a man tried to warn me in my own office that something was wrong, and you stood there and lied to my face and let me fire him on Christmas Eve. You let me destroy an innocent man's life to protect yourself. Victoria." His daughter sat in our lobby for 2 hours, waiting to go see her grandmother. Victoria said, her voice breaking on the word daughter. "And you let me throw her father out into the snow so you could keep stealing for 2 more months. $4 million more, Richard, after he warned us, after he tried." There was a long silence on the line, broken only by the distant sound of waves somewhere behind Richard. The laughter of tourists, who had no idea they were standing 20 feet from a man whose life was ending in real time. "I'm sorry," Richard finally said, and it came out small, almost childlike. Nothing like the smooth, confident voice that had manipulated boardrooms and steered Victoria's trust for 9 careful years. "I don't think you are," Victoria said. "I think you're sorry you got caught." And she hung up. Richard stood on that sidewalk for a long time after the call ended, the phone still pressed to his ear, even after the line had gone dead. The heat and the laughter and the ordinary tourist sounds of Georgetown pressing in around him, while his mind raced through options that all led to the same place. There was nowhere left to run that $14 million in frozen traceable funds wouldn't eventually catch up to. He could disappear maybe for a while, but disappearing meant leaving everything behind. The accounts frozen and useless. Now anyway, the house in Connecticut, the life he'd built on a foundation of careful patient theft. And disappearing, he knew with sick clarity, only made a man look guiltier when the cameras eventually found him. He flew back to New York the next morning. Federal agents were waiting for him at the gate. The arrest happened fast, almost anticlimactically fast, for something that had taken 26 months to build and would dominate financial news cycles for weeks afterward. 2 FBI agents in plain suits approached him as he walked off the jet bridge, said his name, showed him a badge, and within 90 seconds, Richard Voss, Chief Financial Officer of Sterling and Cross Capital, the man who had orchestrated the theft of $14.3 million from his own firm's clients, the man who had calmly destroyed an innocent employee's career to cover his own crimes, was being walked through JFK International Airport in handcuffs while business travelers pulled out their phones to film it. The video was online within the hour. By that evening, it had 3 million views. Ethan saw it for the first time on his own phone, sitting at his kitchen table, while Sophie did her homework across from him. A bowl of mac and cheese steaming between them, a small luxury he'd allowed himself that week. Now that Karen had explained the SEC's whistleblower program meant there might eventually be a financial recovery coming his way, even if it would take months to process. He watched the video twice, his chest tight, with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Not joy exactly. Not even satisfaction. Something closer to a long exhale after holding his breath for 2 months straight. "Daddy." Sophie looked up from her math worksheet. "What are you watching?" "Nothing, baby." He set the phone face down on the table. "Finish your homework." But word traveled fast the way it always does, and by the next morning, every major financial news outlet in the country was running some version of the same story. SEC arrests Sterling and Cross CFO in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. A few of the more thorough reporters digging into court filings that had become public record overnight found the name of the original whistleblower buried in the documentation: Ethan Carter, a compliance officer terminated in December after reporting suspicious activity that it turned out had been entirely accurate. By Thursday afternoon, a reporter from the Wall Street Journal was calling Karen Whitfield's office, requesting comment, requesting an interview with Ethan himself. By Friday, 2 more outlets had called. By the following Monday, Ethan Carter's name and face were appearing in articles with headlines like "The Whistleblower They Fired on Christmas Eve," and the story that had nearly destroyed him was being told finally the right way around. He didn't enjoy the attention. He told Karen as much during a phone call that week, sitting on the fire escape outside his apartment because Sophie was asleep and he didn't want to wake her pacing around inside. "I don't want to be famous for this," he said. "I just wanted someone to listen to me in December." "I know," Karen said. "But Ethan, listen to me. This attention is actually working in your favor right now. Sterling and Cross can't quietly bury this anymore. There's a paper trail, there's federal charges, and now there's public scrutiny. That makes them accountable in a way that wouldn't have existed if this had stayed quiet." She was right, though Ethan wouldn't fully understand how right until the following week, when his phone rang with a New York number he didn't recognize, and a voice on the other end identified herself as Victoria Sterling's executive assistant, requesting a meeting at his earliest convenience. He almost said no. Some instinct, some scar tissue from December told him not to walk back into that building, not to give them another chance to humiliate him. But Karen encouraged him to take the meeting with her present on his terms, in a neutral location if he preferred. And after a long conversation with Sophie's babysitter, Mrs. Alvarez, about whether he was making the right decision, he agreed. They met in Karen's office instead of Sterling and Cross headquarters at Ethan's insistence. Victoria arrived alone without an entourage of lawyers or PR handlers, which surprised both Ethan and Karen sitting down across the small conference table in a coat that looked far less expensive than anything Ethan had seen her wear before, her face thinner than he remembered, the sharp polished confidence from December noticeably absent. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," she said. Karen said it was important. Ethan replied, his tone neutral, guarded. Victoria nodded, folding her hands in front of her on the table, and for a moment she said nothing, as though searching for words she'd rehearsed, but couldn't quite locate now that the moment had arrived. "I've spent the last 2 weeks going through everything," she finally said. "Every report you filed before December. Every memo. Every meeting request Richard canceled, every email you sent to compliance that got buried or ignored. I had my own team pull the records separate from the forensic audit, because I needed to understand exactly how badly I failed you. And Ethan, it's worse than I thought. You tried to warn this company 9 separate times over 6 weeks. 9 times. And every single one of those warnings either got intercepted by Richard or dismissed by people who trusted him more than they trusted you. Because he'd been here longer. Because he was charming. Because—" She stopped, her voice catching. "Because it was easier to believe a single father stretched thin after his wife's death was unstable than to believe a trusted executive was a thief." Ethan didn't say anything right away. He'd imagined this conversation 100 times over the past 2 months, imagined what he'd say if Victoria Sterling ever sat across from him and admitted she was wrong. And now that the moment had finally arrived, he found that most of the anger he'd carried for so long had quietly burned itself out somewhere along the way, replaced by something closer to tired clarity. "I'm not here for an apology," he said finally. "I appreciate it. But it doesn't pay rent, and it doesn't give me back 2 months of my life, or the watch I sold to keep the heat on, or the 400 resumes I sent out that got rejected because someone at your company quietly blacklisted my name." "I know," Victoria said. "Which is why I'm not just here to apologize." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, and Ethan felt his chest tighten at the sight of it, an echo of December, until he saw what was actually inside. "I'm offering you full reinstatement. Your old position, full back pay for the time you were terminated, retroactive benefits, and if you wanted a promotion to Director of Compliance, reporting directly to me, with full authority to overhaul our whistleblower protections from the ground up, so that what happened to you can never happen to anyone else at this firm." Karen, sitting beside Ethan, raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, letting the offer sit in the room. "Why would I want to go back?" Ethan asked quietly. "To the place that did this to me." "You wouldn't be going back to the same place," Victoria said. "I've already started the process of restructuring. Richard's position has been eliminated entirely, obviously, but I've also brought in an independent ethics board outside the firm with the power to investigate any future complaint without my approval or interference. I should have built something like that years ago. I didn't, because I trusted Richard's judgment over building real systems of accountability, and that trust cost this company $14 million and very nearly cost you everything." "And if I say no," Ethan asked, "then I'll still make sure you receive the back pay and benefits you're owed, and I'll personally make calls to undo whatever damage was done to your professional reputation," Victoria said. "This offer isn't conditional on you forgiving me, Ethan. I'm not asking for that. I'm asking if you'd be willing to help me build something better than what failed you." Ethan sat with that for a long moment, looking out Karen's office window at the gray February sky, thinking about Sophie at home with Mrs. Alvarez, thinking about the 11 pages of handwritten notes that had started all of this, thinking about Marcus at the food bank, whispering that 2 more people had been fired for asking questions. "I need time," he said finally. "I'm not making this decision today. That's fair?" Victoria said, standing, gathering her coat. "Take whatever time you need. The offer doesn't expire." She paused at the door before leaving, turning back to look at him one more time. "For what it's worth," she said, "the night you fixed my car on that highway, you didn't owe me anything. I'd just fired you. I'd humiliated you in front of your daughter. And you stopped anyway in the freezing cold and fixed my car for free, and didn't even stay long enough to let me properly thank you. I think about that more than I think about almost anything else from these past 2 months. I don't know many people who would have done what you did that night." She left. The door closed softly behind her. Ethan sat in the silence of Karen's office for a long time afterward, the folder containing Victoria's offer still sitting unopened on the table in front of him. "What are you thinking?" Karen finally asked. "I'm thinking," Ethan said slowly, That I didn't do any of this to get my old job back. I did it because it was right. And going back now, accepting a promotion, a fancy title, it feels like it's turning something that mattered into something transactional. It doesn't have to be transactional, Karen said gently. It could be something else entirely. Think about Marcus. Think about Sandra and Felix fired for asking the wrong question. Think about whoever's sitting in that building right now scared to report something they've noticed because they watched what happened to you in December. If you walk away completely, that fear stays exactly where it is. If you go back with real authority, real power to change how that company treats people who tell the truth, that fear might actually go away. Ethan thought about that for a long time after he left Karen's office that afternoon. Walking the 11 blocks home through a light indifferent snow, his mind turning the decision over from every angle. He thought about it while he made dinner for Sophie that night, while he helped her with a book report, while he tucked her into bed, and sat afterward at the kitchen table, with Victoria's folder open in front of him, reading through the details of the offer line by line. He didn't make a decision that night, or the next, or even the one after that. What he did instead, over the following weeks, was focus entirely on rebuilding the small, fragile stability that 2 months of crisis had stripped away. He picked up Sophie from school every day instead of relying on Mrs. Alvarez. He took her to the dentist for an overdue checkup. He fixed the leaky faucet in their bathroom that had been dripping since January. He started sleeping again, real sleep, 8 hours at a stretch, for the first time since December. He let himself finally just be her father for a while without the weight of a federal case or a stolen fortune or a betrayal hanging over every quiet evening. It was during this stretch in the gentle, unremarkable rhythm of ordinary days that the SEC's whistleblower award determination finally came through a formal letter from Karen's office, informing him that based on the size of the recovered funds and the significance of his original report in breaking the case, he was entitled to a substantial percentage of the total amount recovered from Richard Voss's frozen accounts. It wasn't a number that changed everything overnight, but it was enough to pay off the rest of what he owed, enough to replace the watch he'd sold, enough to finally exhale. He cried reading that letter alone at his kitchen table, in a way he hadn't let himself cry since December. 2 months of fear and exhaustion and quiet grinding fear, finally breaking loose all at once. Sophie found him there a few minutes later, having woken up for a glass of water, and climbed into his lap without asking why he was crying the way children do when they sense more than understand that something important has finally shifted. "Are you sad?" she asked. "No, baby," Ethan said, holding her close, his voice thick. "I think for the first time in a long time I'm actually okay." Outside, the city moved on around them, indifferent, and ordinary snow melting slowly into the first thin signs of an early spring, while 40 floors up in a glass office that had once cast him out into the cold Victoria Sterling sat at her desk late into the evening, staring at an unopened email from Ethan Carter that had arrived only an hour earlier, his decision finally made, waiting for her to read it. Victoria opened the email with her hand hovering over the trackpad for almost a full minute before she let herself read it. It was short. Shorter than she expected from a man who'd spent 2 months building a case detailed enough to take down a federal fraud scheme. Victoria, I'll take the position. Not for the title and not for the back pay, though. I won't pretend that doesn't help. I'll take it because Marcus is still scared to talk to HR, because Sandra and Felix never got their jobs back, and because somewhere in that building right now, there's probably someone who noticed something wrong and is too afraid to say it out loud. If I can fix that, it's worth walking back through those doors. But I'm doing it on my terms. I want to meet with the board directly. I want written guarantees, not promises. And I want my first project to be finding out what happened to every employee Richard pushed out over the last 2 years. Let me know if that works for you. Ethan. Victoria read it 3 times. Then she picked up her phone and called him, even though it was past 9 at night. He answered on the second ring, the sound of Sophie's cartoons faint in the background. "Hello." "I got your email," Victoria said. "Everything you asked for, it's not just acceptable." Ethan, it's exactly what this company needs. I should have offered all of it without you having to ask. I figured I'd ask anyway, Ethan said, and for the first time since December, Victoria heard something almost like humor in his voice. Old habit. Compliance officers like things in writing. Smart habit, Victoria said. Can you come in Monday? I want to introduce you to the board myself. I want them to hear directly from you what almost happened to this company and why it's never happening again. There was a pause on the line, the cartoon noise fading, as Ethan presumably walked into another room. Monday works, he said. But Victoria, I need you to understand something before I walk back through those doors. I'm not coming back to be a symbol. I'm not interested in being the company's redemption story for a press release. I'm coming back to do a job, and that job is making sure nobody else goes through what I went through. If at any point I feel like I'm being used to make Sterling and Cross look good, instead of actually being good, I walk. No warning, no negotiation. I've already lost everything once. I'm not afraid to lose it again. Understood, Victoria said quietly. And Ethan, for what it's worth, I don't want a symbol either. I want someone in that building who will tell me the truth, even when it's inconvenient. I had that once, and I let him get fired because someone I trusted more was lying to my face. I don't intend to make that mistake twice. Monday came cold and bright, the kind of crisp early March morning where the sun is sharp, but the wind still cuts straight through a coat. Ethan stood outside the building on Wall Street, where 2 months earlier, security guards had marched him out the front doors, while his daughter waited in the lobby, holding a candy cane. He stood there for a long moment, just looking up at the glass tower rising into the pale sky, feeling the weight of everything that had happened since the last time he'd walked through those doors. He wasn't the same man who'd been dragged out in December. That man had been desperate, exhausted, clinging to evidence and hope in equal measure, uncertain whether any of it would matter. The man standing on the sidewalk now had survived something that had tried very hard to break him, and hadn't. He walked inside. The lobby looked exactly the same, the marble floors, the soaring ceilings. Even the bench where Sophie had once swung her legs and held her candy cane waiting for a Christmas that never came the way she'd imagined. The security guard at the front desk, the same one who'd given Sophie the candy cane that day, looked up and recognized him instantly. Mr. Carter. He stood extending a hand. Heard you were coming back. Glad to see it. For what it's worth, a lot of us didn't believe what they said about you. Most of us just didn't know how to say so. I appreciate that, Ethan said, shaking his hand. More than you know. The elevator ride to the 40th floor felt different this time. Slower somehow, though the numbers ticked by at the same pace they always had. He thought about the last time he'd ridden this same elevator down, alone, his folder of evidence left behind on a desk, his career, and his certainty, both collapsing in the same 5 minutes. He thought about how far that folder's contents had traveled since then, through a lawyer's office, through a federal investigation, through an arrest captured on video and watched 3 million times, through a forensic audit that uncovered $14 million and 2 more careers destroyed by Richard Voss's greed. The doors opened on the 40th floor. Victoria was waiting for him personally, standing outside the boardroom instead of sending an assistant. And the sight of her there, not behind a desk, not with security flanking the doorway, just standing and waiting, told Ethan more about how much had genuinely shifted than any folder of written guarantees could have. "Ready?" she asked. "Ready," he said. The board meeting lasted almost 2 hours. Ethan stood at the head of the table and walked 12 members of Sterling and Cross's board of directors through everything, the discrepancies he'd first noticed in October, the warnings he'd sent through proper channels for 6 weeks, the meeting where Richard Voss had turned his own crime into an accusation against the man who'd found it, the termination on Christmas Eve, the months that followed, the food banks, the rideshare driving, the watch he'd sold to keep the heat on. He didn't dramatize any of it. He didn't need to. The plain, unembellished facts were damning enough on their own, and he watched the faces around that table shift from polite attentiveness to genuine uncomfortable horror as the full scope of what had happened to him and what it had nearly cost the firm's clients became clear. When he finished, one of the older board members, a silver-haired man named Howard Ellery, who'd sat on Sterling and Cross's board for over 20 years, cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, on behalf of this board, I want to formally apologize. What happened to you should never have happened, and the fact that it took a federal investigation and 3 million views on a viral video to force this company to acknowledge it is frankly an embarrassment to everyone in this room. We failed you. We're prepared to do whatever's necessary to make this right." "I appreciate that," Ethan said. "But I didn't come back here for an apology. I came back because Victoria offered me real authority to fix the systems that let this happen in the first place. I want to walk you through what that looks like if you're willing to listen." He spent the next 40 minutes laying out a plan he'd been quietly developing over the past several weeks, an independent whistleblower hotline operating completely outside the normal management chain. Anonymous reporting protections enforced by an external ethics board with actual investigative power, mandatory review of any termination connected to an employee who'd recently filed a compliance concern, and a quarterly audit conducted by a rotating outside firm so that no single executive could ever again control the flow of information the way Richard Voss had. The board approved every piece of it unanimously. Word spread through the building fast that morning, faster even than the news of Richard's arrest had spread weeks earlier. By lunchtime, employees who'd worked alongside Ethan for years were stopping by his temporary office, the same one he'd occupied before December, just to shake his hand to say they were glad he was back, to quietly admit in low voices that they'd never believed the story about unauthorized access. Marcus found him in the break room around 2 in the afternoon, the same break room where they'd exchanged maybe a dozen sentences, total over 3 years, before that encounter at the food bank in January. "Heard you're running compliance now," Marcus said, leaning against the counter, a coffee mug in his hand. "Direct line to the board and everything." "Something like that," Ethan said. "You remember what I told you at the food bank?" Marcus's voice dropped lower, though the break room was empty, except for the two of them. "About Sandra and Felix." "I remember every word," Ethan said. "I want to give a formal statement," Marcus said. "About what I saw, about the pattern. I should have done it back in January when you asked. I was scared. I'm not anymore." "Whenever you're ready," Ethan said. "No pressure. But if you do it, I promise you it'll matter." Sandra Pruitt and Felix Mercer were both rehired within the month, both with full back pay. Both offered apologies as direct and unambiguous as the one the board had given Ethan. Sandra came back to accounting. Felix declined the offer to return to IT, choosing instead to take a position at a different firm entirely, but he sent Ethan a short, grateful email thanking him for making sure his name was finally cleared, for making sure the official record reflected that he'd been fired for asking the right question, not the wrong one. Richard Voss's trial began in late April. Ethan testified for 2 full days, walking a federal jury through the same evidence he'd once laid on Victoria Sterling's desk. Except this time, nobody dismissed it. Nobody shredded it. Nobody escorted him out of the building for presenting it. Victoria testified too on the 3rd day, her voice steady but visibly strained as she described under oath exactly how completely she'd trusted Richard, and exactly how badly that trust had been weaponized against the one employee who'd tried to stop him. Richard Voss was convicted on 11 counts of securities fraud, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced in June to 14 years in federal prison, a sentence the judge described in her closing remarks as reflecting not just the scale of the financial theft, but the deliberate, calculated cruelty of destroying an innocent whistleblower's career and reputation to cover it up. Ethan wasn't in the courtroom for the sentencing. He'd testified he'd done what the case required of him, and on the day the verdict came down, he was instead sitting in a folding chair at Sophie's elementary school, watching her present her science fair project on the water cycle, to a small crowd of parents beaming with pride as she explained evaporation and condensation with the same fierce, unshakable seriousness she brought to everything. Karen Whitfield texted him the verdict during the middle of Sophie's presentation. Ethan read it, felt something settle quietly in his chest. Not triumph. Not really, just a long, slow exhale. 2 months in the making. And then put his phone away and kept watching his daughter point at her hand-drawn diagram of clouds. That he realized later was exactly where he wanted to be when the news came. Not in a courtroom, not at a press conference, just there, in a folding chair, watching Sophie be exactly who she was, unburdened for once by anything happening in a building 40 floors above the city. By summer, Sterling and Cross Capital looked like a different company entirely, even though the name on the building hadn't changed. The whistleblower hotline Ethan had built was already handling its first real cases. Small ones, mostly billing discrepancies and minor compliance gaps. Nothing on the scale of what Richard had orchestrated, but each one investigated thoroughly, transparently, with the same seriousness Ethan had once begged the firm to apply to his own warnings. Employees who'd once been too afraid to question anything were starting slowly to trust that raising a concern wouldn't end their career. Victoria changed too, in ways that went beyond policy. She started attending the quarterly ethics board meetings personally, instead of delegating them to a deputy. She stopped trusting any single executive with unchecked authority over financial reporting, a lesson she'd learned the hardest way possible. And she made a point every December of personally checking the lobby on Christmas Eve to make sure no employee was ever again escorted out the front doors while their child waited, confused and hopeful, on the marble bench beneath the tree. She and Ethan never became close friends exactly. Too much had happened for that, too much that couldn't be fully undone by an apology or a promotion or even a 14-year prison sentence handed down to the man actually responsible. But something like mutual respect grew between them over that year, careful and earned rather than given freely, the kind of respect that survives precisely because it was tested by the worst thing either of them had ever been part of.
Nothing.
The following Christmas Eve, almost exactly 1 year after Ethan had been marched out of the building in front of his daughter, Sterling and Cross held its holiday gathering in the same lobby beneath the same towering tree, strung with the same gold lights. Ethan stood near the entrance with Sophie beside him, now 9 years old, taller, more confident, wearing a new red coat her grandmother had bought her that fall. Victoria approached them both holding 2 cups of hot chocolate from the small stand the firm had set up near the elevators, and handed one to Sophie. "I remember you liked candy canes," Victoria said, crouching slightly to Sophie's level, the way she had at the gala months earlier. "I made sure they had extra this year." Sophie smiled, took the hot chocolate, and looked between her father and the woman who'd once fired him with the same clear, unbothered honesty she'd carried into every difficult moment of the past year. "Are you and my daddy friends now?" she asked. Victoria glanced at Ethan, a small, genuine smile crossing her face for the first time in longer than she could remember. "We're working on it," she said. "Good?" Sophie said decisively, the way only an 8-year-old, now 9-year-old, can declare something settled. "Because Daddy says forgiving people doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It just means you don't let it keep hurting you." Victoria looked at Ethan, something unreadable passing across her face. "He's right about that." Ethan didn't say much. He didn't need to. He stood there in the same lobby where his entire world had once collapsed in the space of 5 minutes, watching his daughter laugh with the woman who had fired him in a building that finally, after everything, felt less like the place that broke him and more like the place he'd rebuilt with his own 2 hands. He thought, standing there, about everything it had taken to arrive at this particular moment. The 11 pages of handwritten notes scrawled at 4 a.m. on a kitchen table, the watch he'd sold and never replaced. Because some things you choose to remember rather than restore the cold nights. Driving strangers around the city while his daughter slept at a neighbor's apartment. The food bank lines, the rejected job applications. The single sentence he'd spoken on a dark highway that had cracked open a woman's certainty more thoroughly than any folder of evidence ever could. None of it had been fast. None of it had been easy. But all of it, every single difficult piece, had led here to this lobby, to this tree. To his daughter laughing over a cup of hot chocolate in a coat the color of every Christmas Eve they'd survived together. He didn't need an apology to know he'd been right. He didn't need a promotion to know he'd done the right thing. when doing the right thing cost him everything. He'd known it the night he drove away from this building with $23 in his account and a daughter humming Christmas carols in the back seat. Certain only that he had tried, and that trying still counted exactly the way Sophie had told him it did all those months ago. In a car sliding through the snow toward an uncertain future, neither of them could have predicted. Truth. It turned out didn't need to be loud to win. It just needed someone patient enough and honest enough to keep carrying it until the world finally caught up. And Ethan Carter, the single father they'd dragged out of a glass tower on Christmas Eve. The man they'd tried to erase, the man who fixed a stranger's car on a frozen highway and asked for nothing in return, had carried it all the way home.